Okay, so we are looking at day 3 here. This is going to be PowerPoint 5, cardiorespiratory training, right? So what we are looking at today is how to use stage training. So we have talked about this before. I'm going to go a little bit into like how to throw it into a routine, because periodization is such a big part of this course, like talking about how to set up your training splits and how to like stagger your days to make sure you're not overdoing everything and then giving your athletes recovery and stuff. So we'll do some examples that you guys might not have seen just yet in your program design stuff. But then we are also going to sort of switch how we think about cardio. Like a lot of times when you're training like your average person, like cardio is used obviously to improve like heart health. I mean, that is absolutely massive, right? But another big part of it is like really just like burning calories. But with your athletes, burning calories is not really a problem. You know, in fact, a lot of times, like you're burning so many calories, it's like difficult to get enough energy back in on the opposite side in order to like maintain like strength and body size and all that. So we're going to kind of flip our how we refer to cardio today. We're going to really start using the term conditioning, right? So you have like your strength training workouts and you would have like conditioning workouts. And your conditioning should be based on whatever type of sport you are training in. You know, if you are a like even let's say like you want to do a little bit of cardio even as like a power lifter, you know. Obviously power lifters are primarily strength-based athletes. I mean, like that's their whole thing. Cardio doesn't really help them perform that much better in the sense of like heavy lifting, but what it can do is it can condition their cardiorespiratory system to be able to perform more work in general. And so if they can perform more work in general, they can make their workouts harder. They can work harder during their workouts. They can, you know, have better strength gains throughout the season. So there's still like connections here that like a lot of times we don't think about. Like a lot of bodybuilders are just like, ugh, cardio, not interested, you know, like, and that's because they're thinking of like marathoning, you know, they're thinking of like long duration cardiorespiratory workouts that are entirely aerobic based. But we have like, if we think of it as conditioning, we obviously have like an anaerobic way of doing cardio, right? So that's kind of something that's sort of like one of the points we want to make today. So let's go ahead and put that there. And so I gotta stop doing my intro before I have to do the intro slides. So our objectives today, we want to describe how integrated training is going to incorporate cardiovascular work. We also want to be able to provide the guidelines for it. So we will talk about the program design aspects of it. Understand the importance of interval training. So we are going to look at interval training because interval training is really the key for us to be able to condition, right? It's the key for us to be able to work anaerobically and aerobically. And then we'll talk about like how to design a cardio program and put it into like a day by day. So basics, right? Obviously, I love this line here. It's like, thank you, Nazem. You feel my pain. Cardiorespiratory training is often the most underrated component of training. It's the one thing that most people like to skip. I always tell people it's like cardio is either your least favorite thing or it is your favorite thing. There is no in between. It is an all or nothing situation for like every client you've got. So we want to be able to sort of change that up a little bit in order to make it not only specifically challenging so that it meets your athlete's goals, but we also want to like make sure that if we are designing a cardio program, it isn't boring and it isn't like hard to stick to because your client just doesn't want to do it, you know? If it's related directly to your sport, it's going to be something that you prioritize a lot more. So we want to be able to improve performance, obviously, but also some of the other benefits of cardiovascular training is like it does reduce your mental anxiety, you know? Anybody in here ever get like runner's high, you know, doing like long distance stuff? You ever get those like pumping endorphins afterwards? You walk away feeling good?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
No, ever, never.
What was that?
She said never.
Because I hate running.
Yeah, she don't
Yeah,
like
fair enough. Yeah, but it can be, you just have to make sure that you know how to pace yourself, like, specifically. But yes, I definitely get it. I definitely get, like, some folks are more, like, prone to it. Generally, those are the folks that, like, get really into cardio as, like, a sport, um, which makes perfect sense, you know. But yeah, like, a lot of people that I talk to, because don't get me wrong, like, there's always the unpleasant sensation that comes along with, like, cardio training, where if you push yourself too hard and you start to get where you hit your anaerobic threshold, right? So, like, and we'll kind of describe this here in a little bit, but we talk about, like, what your anaerobic threshold is, right? That's that moment where if you're jogging and you're like, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, I could go forever technically, I'm good. And then all of a sudden, like, you maybe hit like a small hill or something, and you're like, I'm good, I'm good. Instantly, I'm gonna die. Oh my God, this is terrible. Like, my sides hurt, and I'm breathing a lot harder. This is, brutal. What that is you've officially hit your anaerobic threshold. Now, what you didn't really realize, because you were going at such a gentle enough pace, you were creating lactic acid the moment you started exercising. In fact, you were creating lactic acid while you were riding in the car. Like, you're creating lactic acid all the time. Like, it's a byproduct of metabolism. But you were creating such a small amount of it that the amount of oxygen that you're bringing in is able to process all of that lactic acid and convert it into ATP, and you're good. It doesn't really sit around for too long. But the more work you do, the more lactic acid is going to be produced, because you are creating more and more ATP. So by creating more ATP, you have more lactic acid as a byproduct. That byproduct eventually is sitting around. Some of it's getting converted to ATP, like when you're in your aerobic state, when you're in your high duration metabolism, that lactic acid's getting converted into NAD and FAD, and then that NAD and FAD is being, converted into ATP. A lot of letters when you're talking about cardio. But, like, some of it you can only process so much at a time. So the more lactic acid that, like, sits around, the more it starts to make your muscles ache, and the more it starts to burn, and the more you start to get that nasty taste in your mouth, like all that stuff that's kind of associated with cardio, and your legs start to get tired. That is where you hit your anaerobic threshold. I always like to use fake numbers to kind of highlight this, but let's say you are going for a jog, and you are, bringing in enough oxygen to process 100 units of lactic acid, right? Like, your lungs have a capacity to bring in X number of molecules, and you're metabolically able to carry enough of that oxygen. Like, you can process 100 units of lactic acid. So as long as you are creating, let's say, 99 units of lactic acid, you're good. Like, you're below your anaerobic threshold. Like, you are not, nothing's left over every round. But then all of a sudden you start running up a hill, and you're creating so much ATP that now you're also creating more and more lactic acid as well. And let's say you're creating, again, fake numbers here, 150 units of lactic acid, right? And now there's 50 lactic acid just sitting around, and then the next part of, the next round of metabolic work comes around, and 50 more bits of lactic acid. And so now your legs start to burn, they start to ache, and you have to, like, eventually slow down. And the reason you slow down is because you're going to do less work. By doing less work, you require less ATP. By requiring less ATP, you are generating less lactic acid, and so your body has time to process any of that leftover stuff. And that's where that burning sensation kind of goes away when you slow down, put your hands on your thighs, breathe it out. That's why you also continue to breathe hard after exercise, because you are processing all of that other stuff that you created. And that's a really great thing, because now you're at a very low amount of work, but you're still, breathing like crazy. That's actually a really good thing. What that is, that's part of what we call EPOC, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit, where you are excessively burning oxygen after the hard work is over. And so you've exited, like, the muscle burning zone and entered the fat burning zone, while you are still getting a massive calorie burn from the work that you did. So that kind of leads me to our last little bit here of cardiorespiratory training, which is cardio is really good for weight management, um, because it's a very easy thing for you to kind of chart out and burn a very specific number of calories consistently. It does burn like a high amount of energy, but it's also something that makes it really easy for you to track how much energy you're burning. Um, one of the issues with lifting weights, if you're doing it in kind of a traditional like single set style, is that like, yeah, you're burning like a lot of energy like while you're mid set, but all that resting time and then like walking from one bench to another, or pulling the plates off things and setting them all up, all that is like not necessarily a high energy burn situation. So cardio is like start to finish, calorie burning time nonstop. So it is really good way for you to kind of deal with like weight management, because it can be like, oh, I need to burn an extra 250 calories today. You can go for a walk. And so obviously it will then improve both the aerobic and anaerobic systems, kind of like we talked about. So really quickly, we do want to review our energy systems. So let's take a look at that here. So energy systems as they are related to cardio, right? So the big thing we need to remember is that we have adenosine triphosphates, which is it's basically molecular currency, like ATP, or actually I should put ATP up there. ATP is basically molecular currency. It is how your body pays for work. If you look at a molecule of ATP, if you look at a molecule of ATP, it actually kind of looks like this. You can see there's a phosphate, and there's a phosphate. And then here is a molecule of adenosine. Not my favorite version of the picture. I kind of like the much more basic version. There we go, just 3 circles. And if you look at it here, you can see you get a molecule of adenosine, these 3 little phosphates here, there's a chemical bond held in between each of these, right? And one thing to remember about like chemical bonds is it's where molecules hide their energy. Like there's a lot of energy trapped in between these bonds here. So like, here's the classic example of like a ton of energy being released. The original like atom bomb, like go back to like the first, like go back way back to like the first example of like an atomic freaking bomb. What we did is we took a molecule, a singular atom of, I believe, hydrogen, because I think they were hydrogen bombs back in the day. I'm actually, don't quote me on that, but we took a single molecule and we split that atom. You took the atom and cut it in half, the smallest unit in the universe, and we cut it in half. And so the universe went, whoa, and it blew up. Like, that's actually what happens with pretty much any chemical bond. When you release things that are bound together, when you break the bond between them, a bunch of energy is released. In some ways, like much more than others. Well, ATP holds a ton of energy between its bonds. Crash Course, Hank Green does a really great analogy that I really like. These 3 phosphates here are kind of like 3 kids all sitting on a single bus seat together, on their way to school, right? And you guys remember like those freaking seats on the school bus, right? They technically were able to fit 3 people. Like they were 3-person seats, I think is how they're officially designated. But if you were in like a 2-seater and there's no place to sit and somebody needed to sit, you hated that 3rd kid. Yeah, you're like, oh god dang, you just had to show up to school today, like, and so we always wanted to kick that 3rd kid off the seat. And that's kind of what's happening here. An ATP molecule, adenosine tri-for-3-phosphates, there's a lot of energy trapped between here. And so what'll happen is you kick this 3rd phosphate off. You actually break it off. And what you're left with is a ton of energy. All the energy that was trapped between that bond gets released. And our cells capture that energy in order to be able to do our work. Right. So what you're left with is what's called ADP. That's adenosine diphosphate, di for 2, right? 1, 2, and then a 3rd phosphate there. Now your body can reattach that phosphate in a lot of different ways. Your body can use creatine kinase to actually reattach that. That's actually why creatine is a supplement, because what that does is that actually donates an enzyme. I should put this still in the way. It actually donates an enzyme that reattaches that phosphate, and so you can break it off over and over and over again, which is really great considering that that is a super fast process. And so it's used for big, big, big bursts of energy. However, it can only last about 10 seconds. So then what's going to happen is you're going to kick into your next energy system, which would be glycolysis. And glycolysis is going to use molecules of glucose in order to produce new molecules of ATP. And glucose is great because it is something that we can store within our body. If we build up a bunch of chains of glucose molecules, you're going to have glycogen stored throughout your body. And then now you have like stored sugar. It's like you have a convenient energy source that we're carrying along with us. And we can use that whenever we are doing anaerobic metabolism, which again is going to be like glycolysis and the ATP-PC system. Both of those are examples of anaerobic. But then let's say, and the advantage here is that, again, it's able to produce ATP really, really quickly. It's able to be like boom, 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 glucose, 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 ATP, 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 ATP. It's able to create it really, really fast. But the problem is that it only creates 2 molecules of ATP for every 1 molecule of glucose, which is cool, but it's not super efficient. Like there's not a ton of it happening. It's just happening really rapidly. It's like if I had to carry a bunch of 1-pound weights, I'd carry them really, 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 really fast, because I'm not really being weighed down on that much. But then what ends up happening as well is the problem with glucose as a metabolism is that there's always a little bit of a byproduct left afterwards in the form of lactic acid. So lactic acid as a byproduct gets left around, which is incredibly acidic. And when it sits where, in your muscles, it starts to make your muscles burn. And it actually damages your muscles. I mean, we've said this before, but when you're in the gym, you're not building muscle, you are breaking muscle. You build muscle once you get back to the kitchen. Well, that breaking down, the reason that happened is, a lot of it, some of it is because the actin and myosin fibers are gripping and letting go and gripping and letting go. And so there's a little friction. And so obviously that creates some cellular damage. But another part of it is when you do work anaerobically through glycolysis, you produce a lot of ATP in order to do that work, but you're left with a lot of lactic acid that sits around, and it's so acidic, it eats your muscles just like your stomach acid does. For the record, it is not nearly as acidic as your actual stomach acid. But that's essentially what's happening. It's you're almost digesting your own muscles, which is a great thing because now those muscles get damaged, and then you go home and your body's like, what did you do to my biceps? I got to repair all that, and then it gets to work at creating new muscle, and all of a sudden you've got, nice looking arms, so, that's the disadvantage to that lactic acid system. That's the disadvantage to glycolysis, is that it creates all that lactic acid. But remember, a lot of times we think of lactic acid as a villain because of the way it makes us feel. We're like, oh God, my muscles burn freaking lactic acid. We often think of that as a bad thing. But here's the thing. The reason you create lactic acid is because there's another thing in all of your cells, this special little organelle called mitochondria. And mitochondria is really good at taking lactic acid in as a fuel source, along with a little bit of oxygen, and spitting out even more ATP. So as much as lactic acid is a byproduct of glycolysis, it is also a fuel source of our aerobic metabolism, our long duration metabolism. So lactic acid comes in, a little bit of oxygen comes in, and boom, you create a ton of ATP. Remember, for 1 molecule of glucose, we are creating about 2 molecules of ATP. Well, that original molecule of glucose created a bunch of lactic acid. That lactic acid goes into the mitochondria. And so, yeah, you got 2 ATP out of the glycolysis part of it, but you're going to get about 38 ATP, depending on who you ask. This is the thing. This number is still being being like observed and proven and stuff. So these numbers are going to be all over the place when it comes to like how much ATP is created. I believe NASM stands on, what is NASM stands on it? I want to make sure that I tell you the right numbers here. NASM aerobic ATP production, because this was actually a lot smaller back when I was studying. They used to say it was way lower. Molecules. No. Come on, help me out here. How many molecules ATP according to NASM?
It was like 36 last time, right?
Yeah, I think NASM stands as 36 because they say 38 because it's 2 from glycolysis and an additional 36. Some people are going up to like 42 at this point. Like we're finding more and more and more. The thing is, and none of it, like it's kind of a moot point. Like it honestly doesn't really matter all that much because at the end of the day, like you're never just creating that much ATP. Sometimes your cell, you have a really efficient cell over here that's creating a ton, and sometimes you have an inefficient cell over here that's creating way less. I just realized it's not gonna be in this, and it's not gonna be in the slides in a second, is it? No. It's like that'll be embarrassing. Yeah, we can say 36. No. All right. I mean, it's not in your regular textbook anyways, so they're not going to test you on that number. I just want to make sure that like when you read it in our physiology, our exercise phys class, where we do tell you how many it is, it's consistent. Because you guys know how much inconsistencies drive me crazy. All right, we'll say 36. But everybody in your brains put an asterisk next to that number. All right, so that's awesome. Like one molecule of glucose, a single molecule of glucose created 2 ATP in glycolysis and 36 molecules of ATP in your aerobic metabolism. So that is a much more efficient thing. However, here's the problem with the aerobic metabolism. It may be creating a ton of ATP, but it does it relatively slowly. It's not creating like this. Instead, it's like wham, wham. Like there's a little bit of rest in between. So it's a different process used for each. And if you imagine like that super efficient, creating lots of ATP, and then like you can kind of coast on how much you created and then create a lot again, it makes sense as to why your aerobic metabolism is long duration and your anaerobic metabolism is very intense, short duration. So ATP is a high energy molecule that our bodies use to use as a fuel source for all metabolic activity. Okay, so it is like I said, we'll give a little explanation here. There is a lot of energy trapped in between the phosphates bonds. When those bonds are broken, those bonds are broken, energy is released, and our bodies capture that energy to pay for the work our cells do. Okay, so there's a lot of energy trapped between those bonds, and when that bond is broken, our bodies capture that energy in order to do a whole bunch of work. So training for cardio is going to improve your ability to, sort of do this entire process, right? This ability to like make ATP. So now there are 2 kind of main energy systems in terms of categories here. So you're going to have your anaerobic system and your aerobic system. I love the way in your regular textbook and in a lot of like biology classes, we kind of teach it in order of we kind of teach it in the order of like how it goes duration wise. Like we start with glycolysis, then we talk about like the aerobic metabolism, and then we go through like the aerobic metabolism is very complicated, so we go through like the 3 different versions there. But I really like the sports book because they actually flip that around, and they start by teaching the aerobic energy system first. Um, and then they go into like glycolysis, which is really kind of how it works sometimes. You know, if you're mid cardio, like you're running and you're like long duration, you're like, I'm good. And then all of a sudden, like you go uphill and it's like, oh, I'm entering glycolysis. Oh my God, like that's a lot of high energy work. You start breathing like crazy. So I really like the way that they do that because it kind of is like a very real world example. Like you're playing sports and like you're out there on the field jogging, setting up for position. All of a sudden you have like a play, so you break away, you know? And that breaking away is very anaerobic because it's very intense. So I like this version here, but we're going to kind of review this and then I'll go back and put it in our notes here in just a second. So a quick review of our energy systems. Your aerobic or oxidative system is a very complicated energy system because it's got three main parts to it. It is going to metabolize in the presence of oxygen, and it's going to use glycogen and fats as a fuel source. But primarily, your body is going to shift to fat as a fuel source during aerobic metabolism. So your aerobic metabolism is your long duration stuff. It's anything greater than about 2 minutes. If you're training consistently for greater than 2 minutes, you're primarily burning fat as a fuel source. Which is kind of interesting because if you think about it, like everybody on this call right now, you guys have been up for a little while, you're awake, you're sitting upright, all that like sitting upright obviously takes like a certain amount of muscle, right? Like if I'm leaning back like this, I'm recruiting less muscle right now. But if I'm sitting upright, like my core is doing a little bit of work, my muscles are keeping me upright right now, just like yours are. And they've been doing it for greater than 2 minutes, right? Which means you are in the aerobic metabolism when it comes to like how those muscles are generating energy. Now, you're not doing a ton of work, you're not doing very much work right now, but your primary fuel source is fat as of right now because you're in a very long duration. Fat has 9 calories per gram. That's a lot of energy trapped in a very, small amount of material. Whereas carbohydrates, you get 4 calories trapped in 1 gram, right? So if you've got all this energy and you've got fat stored on your body can tap into that. And essentially it has an unlimited fuel source for long duration work. Whereas the amount of glycogen you've got stored on your body is pretty limited. So we don't want to burn through our glycogen stores because our glycogen stores are how we get glucose, which provides us with anaerobic work, which is our super high intensity work. So you've shifted, like let's say anybody who worked out this morning, you were probably very much doing like a lot of intense work. You were primarily using glucose as a fuel source because the intensity was relatively high. But now that your intensity is low and your duration is really long, you've shifted to more of a fat burning style of metabolism. You're burning primarily fat for fuel here. And that's great because you want to have that energy to do it for a long amount of time. The problem is if weight loss is your goal, the bummer is that you're just not burning very many calories right now. We're all sitting down, probably. I know Jay likes to lie down. We're all like chilling right now. That's not exactly burning very much energy. So even though fat is a fuel source, it's not burning very many calories. And so now, like, we need to like start talking about like, well, how do we want to, like, how many calories are we trying to target during our workout? And that's where you can kind of start to see where we are leading into the later part of this PowerPoint. We're going to start talking about interval training today, where we burn a lot of calories. Unfortunately, those calories are coming from carbs, and then we recover in a place where we're burning fat as a fuel source. And so like we kind of undulate and create these waves. And that's a really handy thing there. So your aerobic metabolism is going to take place in your mitochondria. It is incredibly efficient at producing ATP, like we said, 36 molecules every time. And it is your main energy system when you are at rest, when you are doing light activity, or when you are doing prolonged low intensity exercise. Then you have your anaerobic energy system. Your anaerobic energy system is the intense stuff, right? Like this is like when you're playing sports and you're trying to sprint past somebody, right? This is the super intense stuff. Anaerobically, you've got two systems here. Today, we're primarily going to be talking about one of them, which is glycolysis. And that's sort of the main energy system anaerobically. So glycolysis is how we metabolize things in a lack of oxygen environment, right? Either your body is choosing not to bring in lots of oxygen because it doesn't need to do like prolonged bouts and it knows that's going to be short and intense, not a lot of oxygen there, or it is going to be you are hitting your anaerobic threshold and it's like, that's it, I can't bring in any more oxygen. And so now you are literally running out of air. This is literally the sensation of being out of breath, which is how I love to describe it to my clients. You know, if I write a workout and it says go do 2 minutes of cardio or something like that, I don't tell my clients I do tell my clients, I tell my clients, don't treat it as like, okay, I'm resting for my next like set of push-ups, and so I just got to go fill my time with 2 minutes of cardio. Don't approach it like that. Approach it like, okay, I have 2 minutes to get out of breath. I have 2 minutes to run out of oxygen. How hard do I have to work in order to ensure that that happens? And I love it. If you work so hard that you run out of air in 30 seconds, that's great. I would much rather have somebody push so hard in that initial 30 seconds than I would make it to 2 minutes and be like, meh, I'm good, and then go back to the next exercise. And the reason I don't like one versus the reason I like that approach so much more is because it makes them train anaerobically. It ensures that they're working as hard as they can. So that is your glycolytic system. It metabolizes without oxygen. And so because of that, that lactic acid sits around. This is why the burning happens. We do use glucose as a fuel source, right? Glucose glycolysis, right? And this is used for high power, high power, short duration work. Oh, it is at the ATP-PC system. I'm sorry, I thought we were going to skip this today. And then there's one more energy system here, which is the super duper intense energy system. Now, this is not a traditional energy system in the sense that you are making molecules of ATP. The ATP-PC system actually recycles molecules of ATP. So it will split a molecule of ATP, and then it will actually use, the reason this is called the ATP-CP system or PC system, you can flip these two around depending on how you describe it, is it stands for, and boy is this a mouthful, the adenosine triphosphate creatine phosphate system. Or sometimes it'll be referred to as the adenosine triphosphate, and then these will be flipped to PC, phosphocreatine system. Phosphocreatine, creatine phosphate, whatever you want to call it, it's the same. They switched it on me after I got out of school. So this is also sometimes referred to as the phosphagen energy system. All of those describe this energy system where you basically split a molecule of ATP, and then an enzyme trapped in a molecule of creatine here will actually donate its enzyme and reattach that phosphate. So if you imagine like you have a molecule of ATP, you pop that third P off of there, and then this enzyme donates itself, boom, it reattaches it, and you can just bam, bam, bam. You can attach it, break it, attach it, break it, attach it, break it. And that's really cool because it's like, bah, 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 bah. It creates a ton of ATP super quickly. And then immediately gets exhausted. You run out of enzymes and you got to switch into glycolysis. So this is your very high power, very low duration style of exercise training. High intensity, short duration activity. And that occurs at your myosin, in between the actin and the myosin molecules. So those are all of our energy systems. Like I said, I do love the way the sports book does it. It goes from aerobic to anaerobic. However, when it comes to note taking, we are going to flip it and kind of teach it the traditional way here, which is why I was waiting to get all the way through it. But let's get our energy systems here. Let's start with the anaerobic energy systems. Anaerobic, which stands for without oxygen energy systems. That's going to be your ATP PC system, actually, yeah, no, we want to go with PC. That's the adenosine triphosphate and then phosphocreatine system. This is your first one. This is used for high intensity, ultra low duration work. Okay, this lasts for about 5 to 10 seconds. If you are absolutely like a power lifter, like strongman trainer, and you spend most of your time training in the ATP PC system, maybe you can get that to last a little bit longer than 10 seconds, but really that's about how it lasts. So here's a quick look at the ATP energy systems. Here's a look at like what these energy systems look like in terms of power output. Actually, you know what? I know the NASA one is out there on the internet. Just because I want to pull up the one that's on your textbooks. There it is. High res? Maybe? A little better look. Oh God, please don't pixel. Oh. Hold on, let me see if I can find a high quality one. That's the first one. Oh, here's a black and white one. That's okay, that'll be fine. It's the same chart, it's not colored. So take a look here. Look at this. This right here is your exercise duration. This right here is your power output. Okay, so this is how much you are lifting. Like let's say your 1 rep max on a barbell squat is 100 pounds, right? This is where you are lifting 100%, AKA 100 pounds. You can do that if your duration is less than 10 seconds. So your ATP PC energy system, which is your immediate energy system, is like, I'm creating lots of work, and then immediately is exhausted. And it's like, all right, somebody else take over. So immediately as it drops, now glycolysis has like been breaking down glucose molecules to produce ATP in the background while this is doing most of the work. So what's going to happen is now those molecules of ATP are ready to be used to produce energy. And so as this power output starts to drop, right about here, glycolysis starts to kick in. And now glycolysis is being used to do a lot of your work. And then what starts to happen is it starts to dip. Meanwhile, in the background here, there's your aerobic energy system, and it starts to take over. And right here, it like hands the baton off to your aerobic energy system, right around the 2 minute, or maybe if you're very efficient, greater than 2 minute mark. If you're training for glycolysis all the time, you might be able to get your glycolysis to last a little bit longer. Here's the thing, you guys have seen, you know, me in person for the most part. I got these long freaking skinny arms, right? I'm the type of person that like my glycolysis, it does not last 2 minutes. Like my body does not prefer to use glycolysis as a fuel source. My body is like, we like cardio. We want to keep running. And so like my aerobic energy system will kick in really quickly, whereas somebody who trains in the glycolysis, and that's because I do a lot of like high repetition work in the gym. If I prioritize heavier lifting, which I'm not honestly all that passionate about, then I would be much more of a glycolytic athlete. And so you can train for these things. If you're training for high intensity, short duration work with super long rest periods, you're going to get better at it. If you train in glycolysis, you're going to get better at it. And if you train for cardio, you're going to get better at it. So you can extend the duration of any of these, but these are general rules of thumb. And this is how they'll kind of phrase it for the most part. In the most folks, your ATP PC system will last maybe up to 10 seconds. Again, people like Eddie Hall, you know, super strong men powerlifter types, they can get that energy system to probably last a little bit longer. They're not going to get it to last 2 minutes, you know, it's not like it's going to replace their aerobic energy system, but they can get it to last a little bit longer. You look at like certain bodybuilders or a lot of like athletes, like particularly like type 2A fiber athletes, those, you know, fast twitch, like still high oxidative fibers, they can get that glycolysis energy system to last a lot longer. And then you have like your aerobic metabolism that is very much like your type 1 muscle fibers, or you know, the long duration stuff. So if we tie this to muscle fiber types, we've got our 2X here, we got our 2A here, and our type 1 here. So kind of going back to that, and again, that chart is in your books. So ATP-PC system lasts for about 5 to 10 seconds, used for ultra high intensity, low duration work, used during maximal strength lifts, right? So this is your high intensity stuff. So that's anaerobic. Then we have glycolysis, right? You're sometimes referred to, actually, I'll put it up here because this always sometimes confuses people. Sometimes it's referred to as the lactic acid system. That's a really old school term that you probably won't see. They'll probably just call it glycolysis, or they'll call it the glycolytic system, you know. But glycolysis is used for high intensity. I should put, you know what, I'm gonna put ultra high intensity. Sorry, I know that's modifying your notes, I apologize. But we'll say the ATP-PC system is like ultra high. We'll say that glycolysis is high intensity, low duration work, right? This can last generally, like, we want to say lasts about 30 seconds up to maybe, for the most part, like 60 seconds. Sometimes you'll hear people say it'll last anywhere up to about 2 minutes. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put like last 30 to 60 seconds, right? I know that leaves a gap here. You're like, well, what happens to between 10 and 30? Yeah, that is like the kind of crossover between these two. We're also going to go straight to 2 minutes in our next one. It's like, what happens between the first minute and the second minute? Yeah, some people, depends on who you are. You know, if you're a glycolysis person, well, then it's lasting 2 minutes, you know? If you're an aerobic person, it's lasting less. So this is going to use glucose as a fuel source, right? And this is used during heavy intensity lifts, right? So if you think about it, and you look at your energy systems here, this really pairs super well with our power phase of training, and pairs super well with our max strength phase of training. And this pairs really well with our hypertrophy phase of training, maybe a little bit in the max strength phase of training too. Maybe there's some carryover there. And then also maybe it carries into our strength endurance system. And maybe even into, like, you know, it's 12 to 20 repetitions in stabilization. If you're sticking around the 12 mark, that's very much glycolysis as well. So this is really our general strength training system here. This is our super heavy intensity training system here. And then cardio is used to train our next energy system here, which is our aerobic energy system. So we go over here, aerobic, which means with oxygen energy systems. So there's several parts to the aerobic energy system. It is going to be it is going to occur in the mitochondria. This is where you are officially using the byproducts of the lactic acid system, as well as oxygen for a fuel source, right? So this was using glucose and no oxygen. Glucose was its only fuel source, right? That's how we created glycolysis. But then we use the byproducts from glycolysis and oxygen as our fuel, and now we're creating a bunch of ATP that way. So your aerobic energy system is going to consist of 3 primary systems here. It is going to consist of aerobic glycolysis, right? And aerobic glycolysis is sort of acts as the stopgap between anaerobic glycolysis and the aerobic energy system. So this is where basically you are transferring from creating ATP in the fluid portion of your cell, which we call the cytosol, to producing ATP in the mitochondria themselves. Then we have this one is also one that has many names, but this is the Krebs cycle, or sometimes referred to as the citric acid cycle. That's another name for it. And that is going to create ATP in the mitochondria by using the byproducts of glycolysis. So I'm going to pull up a picture of the Krebs cycle here. Do not worry about memorizing this. There's no reason to do that. But this is your citric acid cycle, right? Okay, freaking empty background. Can't do that. Oh my God, all empty background. Oh, where'd the green one go? Hey. All right. So molecule of glucose comes in, it gets converted into acetyl-CoA. So glycolysis spit out a bit of ATP and a whole bunch of this other stuff, right? And then that is going to basically become very similar to orange juice. It actually becomes citric acid, which then will go through this big cycle here. Now, every one of these things here are enzymes. And those enzymes, which have these big, long, super scary names, basically convert different parts of that citric acid into these molecules right here, called NAD and NADH, or FAD, right? And you'll see different people label them slightly different ways. So I'll pull up a different picture here because sometimes you'll see that as well. Again, all the different versions. So you'll see NAD, and you will also see, where's FAD? FAD here. So NAD and FAD are these super high energy molecules that have these little extra like electrons on them. And those little extra electrons are eventually going to go through the next part of our energy system. And that is actually going to be used to create even more ATP. So here's the thing. The Krebs cycle creates 2 more molecules of ATP. So we got 2 molecules of ATP from a molecule of glucose from glycolysis, and we got 2 more molecules of ATP from the Krebs cycle. That leaves, and you remember, like now we are very much in the aerobic metabolism here. So why the heck, I thought we were supposed to get 36 molecules of ATP. Where's the rest of that ATP coming? Well, this is where that NAD and FAD, which is a byproduct, is eventually going to get squeezed through what is called the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is the final part of metabolism that occurs where basically, and let me see if I can find a picture of that actually, the NAD and the FAD get squeezed through this little pump located in the mitochondria. That little pump arranges everything and spits out all these molecules of ATP. Electron transport chain. So this little protein is called ATPase, or ATP synthase. There it is. So see all these little hydrogen ions right here, right? They're these little protons here. Did I say electrons earlier? I'm trying to think back. I think I did. These little protons here, whoops, are going to go through this little pump here, and they're going to get all squeezed together to spit out a whole bunch of molecules of ATP. This little pump is called ATP synthase. Or sometimes like people usually just refer to it as ATPase. But you can see whole bunch of like NAD and FAD, and they have all these little extra like hydrogen protons that are left over. And then they get squeezed through here. And that is where you get the rest of that 36 molecules of ATP. It all spits out right over here, okay? And that is the end of this, right? So it creates ATP in the mitochondria by using the byproducts of glycolysis. It creates ATP and CO2 creates, actually I'll just say CO2 as a byproduct. Uses oxygen as a fuel source. So it needs oxygen and it needs ATP. We knew it needed oxygen though because it's in the aerobic system. Now the electron transport chain is going to use the same thing, creates ATP in the mitochondria using the byproducts of the Krebs cycle. Creates CO2 as a byproduct and uses oxygen as a fuel source. Oh, actually another byproduct and water. So, come on now. All right, so that is a really brief rundown, right, of how we get most of our ATP for long duration work. Again, the big thing that we want to remember, going all the way back up to the top here, is that your aerobic energy system is used for low, you know what, actually, never mind. I don't want to put that there. That'll mess up all your guys' notes. Take this whole thing and indent it one more time. And then we'll go to here. So this is used for low intensity, high duration work, right? Lasts greater than 2 minutes. So 2 minutes into infinity, that is how long your aerobic energy system lasts. Essentially, you could go forever if it wasn't for the fact that you needed food and sleep, you know? You can literally produce energy infinitely. Otherwise, like, you know, what would happen when you're sleeping? So anything greater than 2 minutes here. And again, this is going to uses the byproducts of anaerobic metabolism and oxygen as a fuel source, right? And this is where, do you guys remember when we were talking about the cardiorespiratory system and I mentioned that your respiratory system is responsible for metabolic functioning, and I mentioned that your respiratory system and your digestive system are more closely related than your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system. Like, your lungs are more similar to your digestive system than they are to your heart. Your heart is just there to pump stuff around. Your respiratory system actually extracts fuel from the world that we live in. Same thing with your digestive system. It extracts fuel from the world that we live in, right? We create ATP thanks to our ability to extract glucose from food, and we create ATP thanks to our ability to extract oxygen from the atmosphere. So that's part of the reason why we mentioned that. And again, this is used for for cardiorespiratory training, right? When we think of like cardiorespiratory training, we are thinking of our aerobic metabolism. Okay, how was all of that? That was only, by the way, you're not going to be tested on that in this course. You might get like some duration questions, like, you know, how long does the glycolysis last? But like, how many molecules of ATP, what your fuel sources are, things like that. That's not really the type of questions they focus on in this course. But I always like to review that stuff because it gives you, like, when we get into our rules of like, why can't I do more reps if I'm doing hypertrophy? Why do I have to keep the reps at this range, you know? Or why don't I go any lower on the reps? And it's like the reason for program design, repetitions and tempos being the way they are is because of these energy systems. These energy systems are what defined the VOPT model. So I always like to review them just really briefly. But if you are worried about like getting tested on that kind of material, that's not this course. That's going to be next mod. But regardless, does anybody have any questions about what we just talked about?
No.
Nope.
No, nothing yet.
All right, fair enough. It's so much easier with a freaking actual whiteboard. Let me just say, like, man, do I miss my whiteboard. That's like, all right. I always have like one column dedicated to stuff that is like extra, and then I do all the important test stuff. All right, rant over. Okay, understanding our heart rates. Let's get into like how we can actually train specifically for heart rates, because we also got to get into our core training today. So what is your max heart rate? Well, the traditional formula for finding that is the 220 minus your age. Training intensities, or understanding heart rate. I'm not going to put heart rate formula, I'm just going to put understanding heart rate. So the traditional heart rate max formula is going to be 220 minus your age equals heart rate max, okay? I love this, that they put this in here, but it's a guideline, not a freaking rule. It could be plus or minus anywhere from 10 to 12 beats. You know, your max heart rate could be way higher, your max heart rate could be way lower. Age is not the only factor when it comes to considering like what your actual max heart rate is. So it's the only thing we're considering is age here. That means that it's not a very accurate formula, you know, but it's not bad. I mean, it's not awful. It's just okay, you know. If you have two people who are both the same age, one of them has worked out every day of their life and somebody else has never exercised before, they both have the same max heart rate, but they're in very vastly differently good shapes. So that's the traditional heart rate max formula. Now, there is also the the regression formula, which has been picking up popularity. This is usually used with athletic populations. And I'll put that up here. Typically used for more athletic populations. So this is going to be your 208 minus, and this is 70% of your age. So your age times, hold on a second, I'm realizing this is real ugly. 208 minus your age times 0.7, so 70% of your age, and that is going to equal your heart rate max. If you are training athletes, I recommend using this formula. I use this formula whenever I've got a client that I feel is in pretty darn good shape. If they score really high on the 3-minute step test or the Rockport walk test, I will switch to the regression formula. However, the regression formula is not in your regular textbook, so we don't teach it that often in regular Sochi. But I do want you guys to be aware of it. Then we've got the gold standard, which is a phrase that was literally used in my test when I got my NASM years ago. But it was like, which of the following is the gold standard of formulas when calculating heart rate max? When calculating target heart rate. I've got that phrase burned into my head to this day. They don't say it that way anymore. Basically, they just say, what's the best way? And that's going to be your Karvonen method. So the Karvonen method, or Karvonen, or heart rate reserve formula, because that's the actual name. It's the heart rate reserve formula, or Karvonen method. This is going to be actually calculate the difference between your heart rate max and your heart rate rest. So this is going to be your heart rate max minus your heart rate rest times training intensity. And then you need to add your heart rate rest back on. Okay, equals target heart rate. So that's the formula there. They've got it written a little bit differently here, but they just did like, I wrote heart rate max, they wrote 220 minus your age. So 220 minus your age, minus your resting heart rate, times training intensity, add your resting heart rate back on at the end. So again, this is a much more accurate formula. It narrows the target heart rate due to taking into account an individual's heart rate rest. So it takes that into account, which is really, really great. Now, there are some issues here. For instance, like one of the limitations with your Karpinen formula is actually something that people in this call right now, myself included, are probably suffering from a little bit, which is like if you are a really good athlete and your heart is super strong because you've been training for years now and you've developed like a low resting heart rate, and then you get into a car accident or the world goes and has a pandemic and you are not able to exercise, your heart rate rest may not have changed very much over the last few weeks, but your cardiorespiratory enzymes have. A lot of them have probably died off, which is fine. They come back very quickly. But like you might find that like, oh, I'm in really great shape. And then like you go out to do your target heart rate based on the Karpinen method, and now it's all jacked up. So be aware of that. There are some limitations with this formula. That's pretty much the only one that's the only like real drawback here though. And you know, is a scenario that occurs very rarely. But it's like after vacation, or if you were in a car accident, or if the world goes into lockdown. That's really funny. I get to use that example for the rest of my career. Now, another method for prescribing intensity is also talking about your respiratory quotient. This is one of my favorite things to talk about when it comes to cardio. So understanding respiratory quotients here. Or RQs, what it is going to be, it is the amount of CO2 expired or exhaled versus the amount of oxygen consumed. So remember going back to our example earlier, I mentioned how you are bringing in 100 units of oxygen, but you were creating like 150 units of lactic acid. That is a measurement of your respiratory quotient, right? We were dividing one by the other. So the way that you are going to find this is CO2 exhaled 0.247. Yes. Thank you, memory. Divided by oxygen consumed. I don't know why I should have done that. Okay, so CO2 exhaled divided by O2 consumed equals respiratory equals RQ. So this is another way to use, this is another way to calculate your training zones. This does require, this is another method for determining training zones, but it does requires sophisticated equipment such as a VO2 max machine. So you can go get your VO2 tested and it can actually tell you what your respiratory quotient is. The higher your VO2, the better. Remember, your VO2 is your volume of oxygen consumed, right? It can use a VO2 machine to estimate that. However, we can, for the most part, estimate where you're going to land on an RQ scale. So I want to show you your RQ here because there's another part of this that is not considered in the slides here, but is very, very important. So respiratory quotient. Take a look right here, guys. Not that one. All right, I'll use the old name, respiratory exchange. There we go. Okay, so take a look. You've got an RER, or this is going to be RQ. RER is, another name for it is respiratory exchange ratio. So you'll see here, An RQ of like 0.8 up to 0.9 is going to be considered zone 1 cardio. Remember, zone 1 cardio is our super long duration, I can keep this up forever cardio. So take a look over here. The training for that starts at 0.8, but obviously, like, we're not just always doing cardio. What about when you're sleeping, right? What is your respiratory exchange ratio? How much oxygen versus how much CO2 are you at when you are sleeping, right? Well, the lowest you're going to go is an RQ of about 0.71. And that is where this chart is right here. 0.71 is about as low as you're ever going to go. So whenever you bring in, let's say, 100 units of oxygen, you are going to exhale about 0.71. You're going to, not 0.71, you're going to exhale 71 units of CO2. So that means that 29 bits of oxygen also got exhaled. Does that make sense, guys? Like if I brought in 100 oxygen and exhaled 71 CO2, 29 oxygen didn't get used. So I also exhaled that. So you're not always, so we always think of it like when we're studying this stuff, basically, when we teach kids like what oxygen is and stuff and like why they breathe, and like, why do we breathe? You're like, so that you can bring in oxygen and get rid of what's called CO2. Like that's kind of a basic version, but you're still exhaling some oxygen depending on how much you're working at. Like you guys right now are probably at like 0.75. Yeah, probably even less than that. Probably like somewhere between here and here. Because we're all sitting down, we're chilling. You're not doing anything too crazy. So the amount of oxygen you're consuming is very low. This is also why CPR works, by the way, which is a freaking good thing. Like the reason you can do like rescue breaths is because you're exhaling some oxygen. If you like sprint over to that person, or like, and I don't know why you would do this, but like if you were to like do a 400-meter dash and then come back and try to give somebody CPR, don't do any rescue breaths. It's not really going to do anything. You've got no oxygen that you're exhaling. You're better off just getting to pumping. Don't take that as real advice. That was just a weird example. I mean, like weird ideas right now. All right, so here's the thing. Take a look over here. This is describing your fuel source. So when you are in an RQ of 0.71, when you are mostly burning, like, consuming very little oxygen, you are burning 100% fat as a fuel source. And your carbohydrate sources, you don't need to burn any, and you don't need to burn any fuel from carbs. So all of your energy is coming from fat. This is when you are asleep, right? This is your lowest energy burn, and all of your fuel is coming from fats. So you guys know the fat burning zone? You ever see this on treadmills? You see a little fat burning zone thing that they always put? I'm trying to find a picture of the Life Fitness ones. They used to put those they used to label those on treadmills all the time. Come on, I'm trying to find like an actual picture of it. Whatever. They're all the same chart. So if you take a look, fat burning zone, a lot of people, when they hear that, they conjure up an image of like, oh, that's what my heart rate should be in order to like burn fat. But you'll notice your fat burning zone, which would be like this in between like this green and yellow section here, like you're doing exercise, you're on a treadmill, which means you're not actually technically only burning fat as a fuel source. You're burning some carbs. So what's funny is like, the only time you're actually in the fat burning zone is when you are asleep. But the problem with that is you just don't burn that very many calories, right? Like you really want to burn fat in the gym, go take a nap, but that's not going to help you lose weight. So the fat burning zone, the way it's actually listed, it is right here. It is right in just before this 0.85. It's like 0.84. It's where 51% of the energy is coming from fats and 49% is coming from carbs. It's just before you make the switch. That's the fat burning zone. But here's the thing. Let's say you continue doing more and more and more work. You start to work harder and harder and harder and harder. Well, now you're consuming more and more oxygen until eventually you are consuming all of it. 1 unit of oxygen comes in, 1 unit of CO2 comes out. No units of oxygen come out, right? Right here, 1 unit of oxygen comes in, 0.05 units of oxygen come out because 0.95 units of CO2 came out. Down here, right, it gets lower and lower and lower depending on your intensity. So these switch. If you are consuming all of your oxygen, you are also consuming only carbohydrates as a fuel source. Now, that sounds like something where you're like, well, I don't want to burn carbs for fuel. I want to burn fat for fuel, right? I want to get rid of like the 5 pounds around my midsection. I don't care about burning off my carbohydrates, right? You're tapping into glycogen for energy. I don't care about that. Well, first off, let's take this in 2 different routes. Number one, let's say what happens if you did burn off your glycogen? Well, what happens the next time you go and eat carbohydrates? Those carbohydrates are not going to get converted to fat. They're going to get converted to glycogen. So you are still burning fat. It's just like you're burning fat in the future. You're burning fat you haven't acquired yet, but you are keeping yourself from being able to acquire it later. So that sounds like a pretty freaking good reason to work hard, doesn't it? Right? So already we've kind of debunked a little bit of this whole don't do hard cardio. If you work too hard, you're not burning fat anymore. I mean, that is technically true, but very misunderstood, right? So there's one reason why. Here's the other thing. Can anybody keep up sprinting for greater, like for a super long duration? Can you stay at that 100% oxygen consumption zone for very long? No, of course not. You can't keep it up, right? You get the side ache, you have to slow down because now you're consuming all that oxygen. Anything beyond that is being left over. All that lactic acid that's being created during all of this work is now just staying around because you can't consume anymore. You're leaving extra lactic acid around. Eventually, you are going to have to slow down. And what happens when you slow down? You're consuming less oxygen. But you still have all that lactic acid that you produced. So your body's going to take that lactic acid and it's going to consume that. And it's going to convert it to ATP, which is going to give you more energy throughout the rest of the day. Now, what that's going to do is you are back in the fat burning zone while you are recovering from the hard work you did. But you are processing all that lactic acid, which takes more energy to process. And therefore, you are getting the benefits of burning fat as a fuel source from the calorie burn that you created by burning carbs as a fuel source. That is why interval training is so effective, because you get this big, super high energy burst. And then your body goes into a fat burning zone while it is burning more calories from what you did prior. That right there is called EPOC, or excess post-exercise. So excessive after exercise, after high intense stuff is over. Oxygen consumption. You're consuming more oxygen after your set is done. Because none of us go for like a sprint and then we're like, cool. Like none of us do that, right? Like you're done sprinting and you're like, you know, like you keep breathing. All that extra consumption is a super high calorie burn while you are in the fat burning zone. So this leads me to my favorite phrase. This is the way I like to phrase this. And you are welcome to steal this because it'll get a good chuckle out of your clients. But here's the thing. That EPOC lasts for like 48 hours sometimes. And some people last up to 72 hours, depending on how efficient your body is. So you get this extra calorie burn that can last days later. You're going to go to bed in between that time where you are 100% in the fat burning zone, but you're burning more calories while you're sleeping than you would have if you hadn't exercised. So this is why I like to say this, and steal this because it'll get a good chuckle. Burning calories in the gym is good, but burning calories in bed is better. And you are welcome to interpret that however you want. So that is why we want to work hard. We want to work hard because it creates a higher calorie burn when we're sleeping, or, you know, as that reference implies, doing other stuff. So he said, getting fired. Let's take a look at the rest of our respiratory quotient here. So we're going to look at our training zones. Actually, you know what? I'm going to put epoch up here as well. Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or epoch, is, what did I do? Yes. Is an elevated calorie burn after intense exercise. Can sometimes last as long as 72 hours. Oh, whoops. The harder you work, the more epoch you create. Okay, this is why we like intense exercise. All right, so that leads us to our training zones, which you guys all are fairly familiar with. So program design principles for cardio training. Now, these do not always have to be specific to this, by the way, but they are designed to match with the OPT levels, but they don't have to. You don't just have to train in like whatever level. If you are a super advanced cardio athlete and you have a client in the stabilization and you are in the stabilization level, you can still very much apply like stage 3 cardio. But in general, we're going to keep them lined up today. So in stabilization, which is level 1, which is phase 1, right? You are going to do stage 1 cardiorespiratory training. So you're going to do stage 1 cardiorespiratory training. Stage 1 cardiorespiratory training consists of zone 1 as a fuel source, right? I'm sorry, as a training source. So that consists of zone 1, which is 65 to 75% heart rate max. That's an RQ of about 0.8 to 0.9. Okay, so 65 to 75%, it's about an RQ of 0.8 to 0.9, which again, if we go back to that RQ chart, you know, we're somewhere between like here and here. You're burning, you know, anywhere from 60 to 30% of your energy from fat. Obviously, the more work you do, the more energy you're going to burn. So you're going to burn like more and more calories. But we can think of this as your fat burning zone, or I'm going to put that zone, or cardio base. Or you can think of it as your recovery zone, right? This zone here, zone 1, will be used for recovery in our later stages of training here in a little bit. So I'm going to give you an example of this, which is going to be new for this course here. But an example is, let's say we're going to put like a 7-day chart here. Insert table, 7 days. Oh God, they all have bullet points. Don't do that. Okay. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So let's say we're just going to do a really, really basic routine here, like the most basic. Let's say this is like a strength training day. And this would be like zone 1. Okay, that's what it would look like. You would do like a zone 1 workout Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, paired up with your strength training workouts Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Pretty simple stuff, right? All right, so now let's, how do I, there we go. Let's look at a strength version here. So this is going to be level 2. So this is a client who is in phases 2, 3, or 4. That is going to consist of stage 2 cardiorespiratory training. And that will consist of zone 1 again, which we'll put zone 2 here, which is 76 to 85% heart rate max. And that is going to be an RQ of anywhere from 0.9 to 1.0. So you're seeing like, whoa, 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 whoa. You might be like immediately going, what do you mean an RQ of 1.0? We're already hitting 100%. How the heck are we going to have room for a zone 3? Well, yeah, technically you cannot go over a respiratory exchange ratio of 1.0, right? Like you can't consume oxygen beyond 100%, right? So how the heck do we have like a zone 3 here? Well, you'll notice when we get to it a second from now, it's just going to be greater than 0.1, which means you are you're producing more energy than you are capable of consuming oxygen for. That's why it's zone 3. The work is actually beyond how much you are going to be able to get rid of lactic acid, AKA you are going to start burning very, very quickly. So we're gonna, and in this version too as well, but we'll get to that in just a second. So this is gonna be an RQ of 0.9 to 1.0, but this, and they're saying 80 to 85, we're gonna use the 76 to 85, because that is the traditional numbers. The sports book breaks it down kind of in a more traditional way. A lot of people use this number here. We're not doing that though. So that is very high intensity. It is very close to your anaerobic threshold. And this is going to increase your reliance on fat. It's actually going to teach your body how to further burn fat as a fuel source, how to get that to last longer. But then over here, it'll completely switch to pure carbohydrate burning. But this will actually increase your reliance on fat because you're going to recover back in that zone 1. So it will get your body to push that fat burning a little bit even further. So zone 2, 76 to 85% of your max heart rate. That's going to be an RQ of 0.9, 0.9 up to 1.0. And this is close to your anaerobic threshold. Right, you are pushing your anaerobic threshold, right? This is very much used to increase conditioning. So beyond your cardio base, this is very much pushing it further, and it will recover in zone 1. So that brings us to zone 1 here, which again is going to be that 65 to 75% heart rate max. And that is going to be used to recover between intervals, okay? So you will, and it's not like you can keep up zone 2 the entire time. You have to make sure that you are recovering your client in zone 1. And you are also not only going to have zone 2 days every single workout. That's actually going to be a little too intense. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a week here, and we're going to see a slight difference here. Instead of just doing zone 1 the entire time like we were doing before, we would do zone 2 on Tuesday, zone 1 on Thursday, and then we would go back to zone 2 again on Saturday. And then we would flip it the next week. Does that make sense, everybody? See how that tracks? Cool. And you still have your strength training days on those other days of training. All right, let's look at stage 3 here. All right, so this is going to be the power level. Level 3, which will be phase 5. We are going to do stage 3 cardiorespiratory training, which will consist of zone 3, which will be 86 to 95% heart rate max. Okay, this is going to be an RQ greater than 1.0, meaning you are doing more work than you can recover from on the go. We'll say, I don't want to like make it totally sound fatal. It's like you're doing more work than you can ever recover from. You're doing more work than you can recover on the go. You are working beyond like your, capacity for continuing to like work, right? This is your high intensity. This is your peak work, right? This is you working as hard as you can. This is peak performance, okay? Usually lasts, if you can get it to last minutes, that's pretty freaking good. But most people, this is very much lasting only a few seconds. And this is an anaerobic work, right? This is high intensity, therefore it must be short duration work, okay? So this is going to be zone 3, and then you're going to recover in zone 2, which is again that 76 to 85%. And zone 1, 65 to 75% heart rate max. So you're going to use all 3 of these zones used for recovery, Now, because this is so intense, very similarly to how we were scheduling our week, right? We kind of want to go back to looking at this. Similar to zone 2, we don't just want to do zone 2 workouts every time. We want to have a combination. So you might have like a zone 3 day on Tuesday, a zone 2 day on Thursday, and a zone 1 day on Saturday, okay? So that's a very consistent way of doing that. So those are sort of week-long examples of how to schedule, a stage 3 cardio routine or a stage 2 cardio routine. So the rest of this, when we're looking at our target heart rate zones, right, you're going to establish your zones for your athlete before doing all this. You're going to know like what your client's target heart rates are by doing that Karvanen method from earlier, or maybe you ran them through a VO2 test and you know what their zones are. But you can use that interval training method to enhance like their cardiorespiratory capabilities. Now, again, if you're training like a power lifter, you don't need to do long duration cardio, but you do want to make sure that you're also not just pushing your client super hard. But so stage 3 cardiorespiratory training would actually be great for a client who is a power lifter. They're going to focus more on sprints with long bouts of recovery rather than long duration cardio. Stage 3 cardiorespiratory training is the super high intensity stuff. This is very much sprinting. This is very much like, I don't know, a mid-distance race, and this is very much marathoning. So you do want to like establish, what type of cardio you are performing based on whatever athlete you're training. Are they a baseball player who's going to be standing in the outfield for a long time, not really doing big, and then they're going to do these big long sprints, these big bursts of energy? Are they a soccer player who's going to be running around the field the entire time, and then they have to be able to burst out of that, but then like be able to recover on the go? What type of athlete are you primarily training for? That is where interval training comes in. Benefits of interval training, obviously, you do get increased cardiorespiratory efficiency. You know, you're going to be combining like work and rest. It'll burn a lot of calories. It's also not very monotonous, which is really nice. You know, people like interval training because it's entertaining. It's like, okay, push, 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 push. Nice job. Recover, bring it back. Really good work, you know? So it's not very monotonous. And then it does increase your metabolism, technically. I really don't like actually saying that because your metabolism is set. But it does increase your metabolic rate by developing that EPOC that we mentioned earlier. So the more work you do, the more EPOC you've got. The more EPOC you've got, the more calories you are burning passively. So your phases that you've got when it comes to a cardio program, you're going to focus on your base training, which is literally like get out, go for a run, see you in an hour. You know, like that's your base training. Zone 1, here it is. Here's your steps for base training. Step 1, start running. There is no step 2. You know, like that's it. Like get going. And then you've got your interval training. Your interval training is where we start, you know, either bumping into stage 2 or bumping into stage 3, depending on how you're doing it. Then we get into, this is a preview of upcoming events, we get into your linear training, which is developing speed, right? So now we're going to start like working on your cardio as well as like, all right, let's see if we can do some freaking pacing, right? Then once you've got speed developed, then we start to work on your ability to get back up to speed after you've changed direction. So that's multi-directional training. So then you start applying agility, right? So base training first, go for a run. Interval training second, go do some HIIT training. Then do some speed work, then do some agility work. And then at the very end here, we do our sport specific training, which is where quickness comes in. Remember, quickness is all about like reaction times, right? So you're doing your speed work and you're going to get hit with a baseball, a football, a basketball, an ultimate frisbee, whatever it happens to be, right? Whatever piece of equipment is flying at you that you have to turn and react to, right? If we're looking at that in terms of weeks, your base training may last up to 1 to 7 weeks, which is a really weird number. It's usually 8. Most people say 8 because it's a round number. It's 2 months. And usually that's like utilizing zones 1 and 2, you know? For most athletes, zone 2 is applicable here. For most average clients, really just your base training is always just going to be zone 1. So here's examples of that, right? Day 1 would maybe be 30 to 60 minutes in like a long jog. Day 2 would be bumping into zone 2, you know, back and forth there. You know, push yourself a little harder, recover back and easier, push yourself a little harder, recover easier. This is one of my favorite routines, by the way, the 3-minute protocol. This is great. I usually love to do like a 3-minute hill climb with like 3-minute, if I'm doing a treadmill, which I hate treadmills, but if I'm doing like a treadmill workout, this is one of my favorite ones. I'll go to the treadmill and I'll set like a consistent speed. I'll get going at that speed. And then every 3 minutes, I'll bump up the incline, but I keep the speed the same, drop the incline, raise the incline, drop the incline. It's really good for your base training. If you're an athlete, base training for a normal client, I want you guys to completely forget zone 2 in general. Normal clients, their base training is only zone 1. This is very much an athlete thing. And 3 minutes in zone 2 is brutal for people who have never done it before, which is why in your regular textbook, when you look at a stage 2 cardio routine, it'll be 3 minutes in zone 1, 1 minute in zone 2. And you just kind of hop back and forth between those two. Then we got our interval training introduced in our phase 2 style here. This again is like a 3-day rotation, kind of like the example we built down here. So this is where you have like day 1 is very much zone 1, day 2 is zones 1 and 2, and day 3 is zones 1, 2, and 3. So you get into your peak and then you go back. Again, this is for an athlete, so they're calling it phase 2 here. I cannot reiterate this enough. For a normal client, this would be stage 3 for them. Athletes have to include speed, agility, and quickness work. So we have like almost 4 phases of cardio training, if you think about it. All right. I know those numbers got confusing. Think of the regular book. don't worry about the sports book. Our priority is to pass our regular NASM test. So always be aware of overtraining. Cardio, especially with cardio, you got to be aware of that kind of stuff. If your client is having trouble sleeping, that's actually a sign of overtraining. If they describe their workouts as feeling drained, like draining, that's a sign. And then obviously, like if they don't feel good an hour or two after their workout, like they just continually feel run down, that is a sign of overtraining. Your training should not interrupt your normal life. If anything, remember, you created a whole bunch of like lactic acid during your workout. And once you go into like recovery zone, all that lactic acid actually gets produced into ATP. That is why, and you guys can attest to this, you feel good leaving the gym. Because now like all that lactic acid you created is getting converted into energy. It's why you actually feel energized when the workout is over. If your clients lose that feeling, it's a sign of overtraining. Other classic signs of overtraining, if their heart rate does not come down in between sets, that's a sign of overtraining. And then obviously injuries and dramatic plateaus are also signs of overtraining. If your client has been consistently losing weight and all of a sudden they plateau, it could be because they're working too hard and their body's like, all right, nope, we are not getting rid of any more body. Clearly we are stuck on a deserted island and I need to maintain, you know? So it's gonna find ways to slow them down. That's a sign of overtraining as well. Yeah, so what you're gonna need to do is determine your starting point. This shouldn't even be in here. This is gonna be something we talk about when we get to periodization. But depending on like your client's like fitness score, you know, if they do really well on the 3-minute step test, you might be able to put them in a more advanced style of cardio training, or if they do really well on the Rockport test. But we'll talk more about that on periodization. And that's it for cardio. All we got left is the super easy core lesson left. How's everybody feeling so far? Pretty good?
Yeah.
Awesome. Jay, you on the floor?
Yeah.
Utilizing that fat burning zone?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to stop the recording real quick so that I can get the 2 separate videos. I forgot to do that on Friday, so I had to upload one giant video. Vince was like, it was a long one today. And I was like, I know, I forgot to split them. All right. So end this recording real quick.